The clock ticks past midnight, casting a pale glow across the room. The document on the screen remains entirely blank, yet paradoxically, the kitchen counters have never been cleaner, and the bookshelves are newly alphabetized. We know the deadline is immovable, we feel the mounting anxiety tightening in our chests, and still, we find ourselves willfully ignoring the very task that demands our immediate attention. This familiar, frustrating paralysis is rarely born of laziness or a lack of ambition. It is an intricate, deeply human paradox where we actively choose immediate relief at the direct cost of our future well-being. For decades, productivity gurus sold us calendars, planners, and time-blocking techniques, framing this delay as a simple failure of scheduling. But modern psychology reveals a completely different architecture behind our avoidance. We are not struggling with time management. We are locked in a sophisticated battle of emotional regulation. The task before us triggers a subtle, often unconscious psychological distress, and our minds are desperately seeking an escape hatch. When faced with a challenging, ambiguous, or tedious project, our brain perceives the associated negative emotions, boredom, frustration, self-doubt, as a localized threat. The amygdala, our primal threat detector, sounds an alarm, prompting an immediate flight response. To escape this sudden emotional discomfort, we instinctively pivot to an activity that offers a quick dopamine hit, effectively soothing the distress in the short term while abandoning the long-term goal. This neurological wiring served our ancestors perfectly in a volatile world where immediate survival always trumped abstract future planning. Escaping a present physical danger was infinitely more critical than contemplating a harvest months away. However, in our modern environment, where survival and success often depend on sustained cognitive tasks, this ancient survival mechanism severely misfires. We unconsciously flee from a complex spreadsheet the exact same way we might have fled from a predator. Behavioral economists and psychologists call this phenomenon present bias. It is our hardwired cognitive tendency to overvalue immediate rewards while heavily discounting future payoffs. To our brains, the present self is a concrete, tangible entity with pressing, immediate needs, while the future self is perceived almost as a vague stranger. We gladly offload the heavy burden of work to this stranger, assuming they will somehow possess the boundless energy and willpower we currently lack. Consider the universal act of setting an alarm for 5 in the morning to exercise. The night before, our present self is highly motivated, making grand, disciplined plans for this idealized future version of us. But when the alarm actually shatters the silence, a completely new present self takes over the decision-making process. This self cares only about the warmth of the bed and the immediate comfort of sleep, instantly hitting snooze and betraying the promises made just hours prior. That quiet betrayal initiates the relentless self-sabotage cycle. The momentary relief of avoidance is almost immediately followed by a sharp, lingering pang of guilt and shame. This guilt compounds the original negative emotions associated with the task, making the prospect of starting even more aversive than it was before. The mountain we have to climb grows taller, not because the task itself changed, but because our internal emotional burden became significantly heavier. Researchers have formalized this complex dynamic through temporal motivation theory. This psychological framework suggests that our drive to complete a task is influenced by our expectancy of success, the value of the reward, and crucially, our sensitivity to delay. When a deadline is far off in the distance, the perceived value of completing the work remains incredibly low. It is only when time rapidly runs out that the sheer panic of impending failure finally overrides our desire for immediate comfort. Yet, relying on that adrenaline spike as a primary motivator is a dangerous and exhausting game. The cortisol rush of a looming deadline might forcefully drag us across the finish line, but it reinforces a highly toxic behavioral loop. We subconsciously learn that we can only perform under extreme psychological duress. The brain begins to associate our work not with mastery, curiosity, or purpose, but with a frantic, stress-drenched fight for professional survival. This internal struggle is not a uniquely modern affliction brought on by smartphones and endless digital distractions. The ancient Greeks had a specific word for it, akrasia, defining the state of acting against one's own better judgment. Philosophers from Socrates to Aristotle furiously debated why rational beings would knowingly choose a path that leads to their own detriment. They recognized early on that human logic is frequently overpowered by the magnetic pull of immediate fleeting desires. Today, however, entire digital industries are meticulously engineered to exploit this ancient vulnerability. The infinite scroll of social media, the autoplay features on streaming platforms, and the frictionless design of online shopping are all weaponized against our prefrontal cortex. They offer a perfectly tailored escape hatch at the exact moment we are feeling the friction of deep, demanding work. The environment we inhabit actively cultivates and monetizes our inherent tendency to delay. But why do some tasks trigger this escape hatch more readily than others? Psychologists have identified specific task characteristics that make avoidance highly likely. Tasks that are unstructured, lack personal meaning, or offer no intrinsic reward are prime candidates for delay. More importantly, tasks that secretly evoke a fear of failure or a deep-seated fear of judgment paralyze us completely. If we never truly start the endeavor, we can never truly fail at it. This reveals a profound, often uncomfortable truth about self-sabotage. It is frequently a twisted, subconscious form of self-protection. By delaying the work until the last possible minute, we cleverly give ourselves a built-in excuse for suboptimal performance. If the project falls short of expectations, we can safely blame the lack of time rather than a fundamental lack of ability. The fragile ego remains completely intact, shielded by the chaotic circumstances of our own making. We see this illusion of control clearly in academic and highly competitive professional settings. A student might spend 3 days designing the perfect study schedule, color-coding their notes, and meticulously organizing their desk, convincing themselves this is highly productive work. In reality, it is sophisticated, socially acceptable avoidance. They are managing the intense anxiety of the impending exam through the mere aesthetics of control, rather than engaging with the difficult, brain-stretching material itself. To understand how to successfully dismantle this architecture of delay, we must look at the role of self-compassion, a concept that feels deeply counterintuitive to many high achievers. We are culturally conditioned to believe that harsh self-criticism is the only effective way to enforce discipline. We relentlessly berate ourselves for our delays, utterly convinced that if we are just tough enough, we will finally snap into a state of flawless action. However, clinical research tells a radically different story about human motivation. Studies tracking university students found that those who actively forgave themselves for procrastinating before a first exam were actually significantly less likely to procrastinate before the second one. Self-forgiveness directly reduced the negative emotions associated with the task. By letting go of the heavy guilt, they removed the very emotional friction that caused the avoidance in the first place. This is the ultimate paradox of overcoming our own delays. The harsher we are with ourselves, the more we fuel the exact emotional distress that drives the evasive behavior. Breaking the cycle requires us to treat our future selves not as unreliable strangers to be burdened, but as close friends to be actively supported. It requires shifting our intense focus from the daunting final outcome to the smallest, most manageable next step. Behavioral scientists advocate for lowering the barrier to entry so drastically that the brain's threat response is simply never triggered. If writing a 20-page chapter feels impossible, the goal becomes writing one single sentence. If organizing the entire garage induces panic, the objective shrinks to sorting one single cardboard box. This deliberate micro-stepping quietly bypasses the amygdala's alarm system, allowing the logical prefrontal cortex to slowly and safely engage with the work. Once that initial heavy friction is overcome, a new psychological mechanism takes over to assist us. The Zeigarnik effect, a cognitive principle stating that people remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks far better than completed ones, begins to work in our favor. By simply starting the task, no matter how small the step, we create an open loop in our minds. The brain, naturally craving closure, gently nudges us to continue the work we previously fought so hard to avoid. It is crucial, however, to distinguish this chronic emotional avoidance from strategic, intentional delay. Not all hesitation is inherently detrimental to our progress. Sometimes deliberately putting things on hold allows for necessary mental incubation, giving our subconscious mind the time it needs to connect disparate ideas and solve complex, creative problems. True procrastination is strictly defined by its voluntary nature and the agonizing knowledge that the delay will ultimately leave us worse off. We live in a culture obsessed with relentless optimization, where every single unmonetized minute is often viewed as a moral failing. This crushing, pervasive pressure only amplifies the baseline anxiety surrounding our daily work. When we actively detach our core self-worth from our raw productivity output, we strip the dreaded task of its heaviest emotional weight. Explaining procrastination as a universal issue of emotional regulation rather than a deep character flaw is a radical act of empathy. Over time, we can actually retrain our neural pathways to tolerate the initial, uncomfortable spike of facing a difficult task. Mindfulness practices, for instance, teach us to simply observe our urgent desire to flee without immediately acting upon it. We learn to sit quietly with the boredom or the frustration, recognizing these difficult feelings as temporary weather patterns moving through the mind rather than permanent, impassable roadblocks. The realization that our brains are constantly running this subconscious cost-benefit analysis fundamentally changes how we approach our days. We stop relying solely on brute willpower, which is notoriously fragile and finite, and start designing physical environments that actively protect our fractured attention. We learn to recognize the subtle physical signs of avoidance, the sudden urge to check the news, the tension in the jaw, and gently, without judgment, redirect ourselves back to the present moment. Ultimately, the way we spend our fleeting days is the exact way we spend our lives. The precious time we lose to self-sabotage is not just a missed deadline or a delayed project. It is a vital fragment of our human potential left completely unfulfilled. By understanding the invisible, powerful forces of present bias and emotional distress, we slowly reclaim true agency over our own timeline. We stop living perpetually in the shadow of our future intentions. The next time the powerful urge to pull away from a difficult task arises, we can pause and acknowledge the quiet, ancient fear operating just beneath the surface. We are not fundamentally broken, and we are not inherently lazy. We are simply human, navigating a wildly complex emotional landscape with a brain built for a different world. By facing that discomfort head on, even for just 5 minutes, we break the cycle, step out of our own way, and finally begin.